So we start in 1 minute, or we don't?
We'll start in 1 more minute.
Let me just let. Okay. Buenos días, bienvenidas y bienvenidos al evento La
Good
Innovación.
morning. Welcome to this event, Innovation as the from the state of
Le pasaré
Jalisco.
la voz a la
Next, I
doctora
will give the floor
Margarita
over to
Hernández para
Dr.
que nos dé
Margarita
su
Hernández.
mensaje de
She's
bienvenida.
going to address
Muchas
us.
gracias
She's
y
going to
gracias a
give us
todos
a
por estar
welcome
presentes
address.
en este
Thank you
evento.
all, and thanks for attending this event.
Mucho gusto.
My pleasure.
Buenos días a
Good
todos y
morning,
todas.
all.
Es un
Good
gusto
morning,
para la
all.
Universidad de
It is a pleasure
Guadalajara
for the
que a
University of
través del Centro
Guadalajara
Universitario de
that
Ciencias de la
through
Salud
the Health
seamos
Sciences
anfitriones de la
University
presentación
Center,
del
we can
estudio
host
El valor de la
this
PI
study,
para la salud y
the
el
value
desarrollo,
of
los
intellectual property
beneficios
for health and
económicos del
development, the
fortalecimiento del
economic benefits
ecosistema
of
para la
the
innovación en
strengthening
México.
of the ecosystem
Agradezco
for
el trabajo
innovation in
conjunto con la
Mexico. I
Secretaría de
thank the
Innovación,
joint
Ciencia
work
y
with the
Tecnología para lograr
Innovation,
este
Science
evento
and
y
Technology
por su
Secretariat
conducto
to
tener vía
organize this
remota
event
a
and to have the
representantes de
possibility of
Interpat,
having
de la
remotely
Asociación Mexicana de Industrias
representatives
de
from the
Investigación
Mexican
Farmacéutica
Association
y
of
de la
Pharmaceutical
Federación
Research Industries, from
Latinoamericana
Interpat,
de la Industria
and from the
Farmacéutica
Latin
también.
American
Bienvenidos y
Federation,
muchas
from the
gracias por estar
Pharmaceutical
aquí.
Industry.
Hoy
Welcome
más que
all, and
nunca,
thanks
en el
for
marco
being
de
with
la
us.
pandemia de COVID,
Today,
se hizo
within the
evidente
framework of
la
COVID
importancia de la
pandemic,
inversión en
we saw
investigación
how
aplicada
evident it
y
is
básica en el área
to
de
have
ciencias de la
basic
salud
research
y
in
su
the area of
vinculación
health
directa
and
con
how
los
it
niveles de
directly
bienestar de la
relates to
sociedad.
the levels of
Por ejemplo,
well-being of our society.
sin los
For
financiamientos de
example,
los estudios
without the
sobre el
financing
comportamiento
for
del
the
ARN
studies to
mensajero en la
study
década,
the
desarrollados
messaging
en la década de los
RNA,
90,
the
no
studies
hubiéramos
developed during
conseguido
the
tener
90s,
vacunas
it
en
wouldn't be
tiempo récord,
possible to
en
have
menos de un
vaccines
año en
in
este
this
caso.
record time,
Esa inversión
in less than
previa
a year.
nos permite
This
recobrar
previous
poco a poco
investment
la
allowed to
normalidad, volver a
recover the
abrazar y
norm,
estrechar a nuestros
the
amigos y
normality little
familiares,
by little, to have
recuperar
the
nuestras cadenas
possibility to see our
productivas, volver a
relatives,
las
to
actividades
recover our
culturales, en
productive
términos
chains,
generales,
to
recuperar
come
nuestra
back to
calidad de
general
vida.
cultural activities and to recover
Estudios
our
como el que se
quality of
presenta
life.
en esta ocasión
Studies like the
conectan las
ones to be
oportunidades de
presented now
investigación en el área de la
relate
salud,
opportunities of
específicamente para
research in
Latinoamérica,
health,
lo que
specifically
nos
for
ayuda
Latin
a
America.
encaminar
All
nuestras
this will help
investigaciones,
us to
conseguir
channel our
financiamiento
research
o
work
bien
to obtain
aprovechar los recursos de las
financing and to take
universidades o de
advantage
los
of the
entes públicos
university
para
resources and
dirigirlos a
public resources
proyectos de
in order to
investigación
direct them
básica
to
y o
basic
aplicada
research
e
projects or
incidir en
applied
diversas áreas.
research projects and
Además,
to
con
be
la
present in
utilización de las
different
figuras de
areas,
propiedad
and with the
industrial
use of the
disponibles para
concept of
proteger proteger estos nuevos desarrollos,
intellectual property protection to
investigadores,
protect all these
instituciones,
developments,
empresas podrán
researchers,
obtener
companies,
beneficios
and
que podrían eventualmente
investigate,
ser
companies
reinvertidos
will
en otras
obtain benefits that
investigaciones
could be
que sigan generando
reinvested in other
productos y desarrollos
innovations in order to bring
tecnológicos
more
para la protección de la
technological
población en
products and
materia de salud. El
developments to
realizar
protect our
estudios a futuro
population.
nos
Doing
permite estar
these
preparados
studies
para
for the
posibles
future allows
eventualidades
us
y
to be
tener una
prepared for
respuesta mucho
possible
más rápida y
eventualities
eficiente
and to be able
ante
to
los
respond
eventos que se pueden
faster
presentar.
and
Sin
efficiently
lugar a
in light
dudas,
of the
la
possible events.
investigación en
There is
salud
no
va a
question
ser
that health
determinante
research
para el
is going to
futuro
be
de
a
la humanidad.
determining factor for the
Buscar
future
nuevas
of
formas de
mankind,
de
to
combatir
look for new
enfermedades,
ways to
prevenir
fight
los
diseases, to
principales males que nos
prevent the
aquejan
main
y
diseases,
también prolongar nuestra
medical conditions,
expectativa
and
y
to be
nuestra
able to
calidad de
expand
vida, que
and to
son un tema
extend our
central
life
para las
expectancy
investigaciones
and quality of
en
life,
ciencias
which
de la
is
salud
very
que hoy
important
están en
for all
curso.
this research work
No
in
me
the
queda
field of
sino agradecer la
science
presencia de
and
todos y
health
todas ustedes
sciences. I would
y
like
hacer
to thank
votos
you
para que
all
estas
and
jornadas
to
de
hope all
reflexión
these
sean
seminars and sessions
enriquecedoras
would
para
allow
todos
us to
nosotros.
enrich our
Enhorabuena
knowledge.
y mucho éxito a
Congratulations,
todos.
and I wish you the best.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thanks a lot,
doctora Margarita,
Dr.
por
Margarita,
esta bienvenida.
for this welcome remarks.
Siguiendo nuestra agenda,
And now,
vamos
if we
a
see our
iniciar
agenda,
con
we are going to
el
start
video de la
with a
reseña
clip
curricular de
with
nuestros dos
the
primeros panelistas.
resume of our first two presenters.
Déjeme solo compartirlo.
I only would like to share my screen.
Andrew Jenner es Charter Manager, miembro del Charter Institute of Management, miembro de la Royal Society of Arts y miembro del Instituto de Ingeniería y Tecnología, con una licenciatura en Ingeniería Mecánica. Es también maestro en Derecho. También es director general de Interpat, una asociación comercial global que busca crear ecosistemas de innovación sostenible para la salud humana. Es director ejecutivo de una consultoría de estrategia y políticas con sede en Reino Unido. Fue director ejecutivo en estrategia corporativa y asuntos legales en la Federación Internacional de Asociaciones y Fabricantes de Productos Farmacéuticos y jefe de Comercio y Desarrollo en la Oficina de Propiedad Intelectual del Reino Unido, representando a la industria dentro de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, la Organización Mundial del Comercio y la Organización Mundial de la Propiedad Intelectual.
World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO.
Pues tenemos aquí al maestro Andrew Jenner. Voy a presentar
now we have
el video de
Andrew,
nuestro
and
otro
I will
ponente del
now
primer bloque
also
de
play
conferencia.
I will also present a clip of our second presenter of the first block of presentations.
Well, thank you so much for that that introduction, and it's a delight to be here. Thank you so much for inviting us, and it would be lovely to be with you in person. So we're hopeful at some point we'll all be able to be with you in Mexico. Thanks, as Dr. Margarita said, to technology that hopefully we'll be able to overcome this pandemic. So I'm going to share a screen with you, and what I thought I'd do is just briefly talk a little bit about what Interpat does, what we are as an organization, a little bit about what is our motivation for conducting these empirical evidence researches in key countries of the world, and then what do we hope that we can both mutually benefit and share together from discussions and platforms like this, because I think the real benefit for us is to hear your perspectives. We're very keen to learn, and I think we're about finding best practice that we can then work together in the deployment, so that we're having that mutual benefit of economic growth, but also the all-important societal benefit. So let me start off by talking a little bit about Interpat. So we're a global association, trade association of intellectual property leaders. So we comprise chief IP councils. That can sometimes sound pretty scary, but they are humans. They've got a lot of experience and expertise, and our role really is to make sure that the IP system continues to incentivize the innovation that we're looking for. We're the practitioners, if you like, of the industry, and we really want to share our practical insights, what kind of things work well, what kind of things don't work well, And we're very keen to hear from others how we can change our practices, how we can change and evolve in order to maximize our innovation, but also as we think collectively as an industry about achieving sustainable access to the innovation that we produce. There's no point in innovation unless we can get access to it. So we think the IP system works generally very well at incentivizing innovation, but we're also very keen to hear about how it can be modified, how it could be changed to achieve both economic and societal objectives. And that's really the emphasis really behind our objectives. One thing that we're very involved with is to create alignment between our companies. Some people think that the pharmaceutical industry all think the same way. For those of you who've been involved with companies, you'll realize that trying to get 30 chief IP counsels to agree can be quite an arduous and tortuous process. But that's what we want to do. We drive then that kind of decision making at that level. And what our CEOs look to us to do is to educate them and to advise them on what is the best way forward on areas of strategic importance around IP. And Interpat has that direct link to the biopharmaceutical CEO Roundtable. Another perhaps more interesting thing that we do, that we like to see ourselves as incubators of new ideas. One example is WIPO Research. It was a project that we worked on with the World Intellectual Property Organization to see how we could drive the development in the area of neglected tropical diseases, TB and malaria, by making connections between our researchers, between academic institutions in many countries around the world looking at these diseases, and if necessary, sharing patent information and technology. Another idea that we incubated in Interpat was Pat Informed, which is also with WIPO, which highlights different patent portfolios covering medicines so that procurement agencies can have access to those patent portfolios when they're looking to procure medicines. And most recently, and something that I'm quite proud of, is that we launched this year on World Intellectual Property Day, the IP Pact. Now, countries are very familiar, no doubt, with what industry needs from government in order to create robust innovation ecosystems and IP systems. But what we wanted to do was to explain how we use the IP system, both to educate and to inform, but also to dispel the myths that may be out there. And this document seeks to tell the story about how we secure our IP and how we use it, and ultimately how we work to tailor our approaches to achieve access. And then finally, we collaborate. We have a lot of platforms for dialogue. For example, in China, we have dialogue with the Supreme People's Court. We've been very blessed to have had lots of discussions in Mexico, facilitated by a MIF, and in other Latin American countries, where we're really sharing our experiences, our expertise, but then learning and adapting as we hear from others. And one thing that we find that enriches that conversation is to have a good baseline of robust empirical evidence. And that's essentially our motivation behind the study that Tim will present in a few moments. What we've identified as the innovative industries, and this goes beyond the pharmaceutical industry, we found that there are four golden threads that drive innovation in the high-tech sectors. And one of them is building investor confidence through a long-term strategy. One thing that can be quite damaging for an ecosystem is when we get new governments who decide to throw away the previous administration's work and start afresh. What innovators are really looking for is that consistency. And this is something that some countries have done incredibly well, and we can learn from them. For example, South Korea, they had an ambition to build a vibrant life sciences sector, And they did that through consistently applying the principles that we're going to talk about together today. One critical component, education, training the workforce. And that's something that we think Mexico does particularly well. But what we want to do is to make sure that those people stay within the countries within which they were educated. Why? Because we all want them to grow the national economic base, but also to work on those societal problems that particularly affect our countries. And what our message to people is that if we create that kind of enabling environment, our experts, our innovators will stay. If not, we're almost encouraging them to go to countries that are getting it right. And so that's something that we really find is interesting for countries to hear about, is how can we make sure that our intelligence, our abilities are not moving to other countries. Two other important components. One is open markets to trade and investment. It makes sense for us as global companies to think globally, but to work locally. And again, those practices that enable free exchange of information, that allow technology transfer offices to work with the private sector, allowing us to build trust together, really accelerate past those that don't. And then finally, an effective regulatory and IP system is critical. If you like, that's the oil of the machine, so that people can share ideas and they can collaborate, knowing what their rights are and their responsibilities and their obligations, creating that level playing field. And so this comes me on to the last slide before I pass over to Tim. And this was really our idea around creating these robust, empirically evident studies within key Latin American markets. We started in Argentina in 2018. It looks alphabetical. There was a rationale behind it, but it looks like we're in alphabetical order here. Last year, we launched the study. Well, in 2019, we launched our Brazil study in the lower house of Congress. And last year, we launched the Mexican IP study. And this year, we're working on the one for Colombia. And essentially, what we're trying to achieve through this is to demonstrate that every country has an ability to create a robust life sciences innovation ecosystem for that virtuous cycle. It may be that you're not going to create every area in that value chain, but there's always some niche that can be identified. And what we can see clearly from case studies is that the countries that get it right accelerate, and those that get it wrong can stagnate their market for 5 to 10 years. And so what we would like to do is to share our experience, our expertise, and demonstrate that having these type of systems in place drives economic activity. And there is always fears around strengthening IP rights. What might that mean? And we want to address those questions, because there may be some jobs that are moved or transferred, but there will be new jobs that are created in value-based areas, which is really about the driving the economic engine of those countries. So we're delighted to come and to present our study. And we think that there's exciting times in many countries, but it's about getting that balance right between short-term needs and long-term objectives, and finding that mutual benefit between ensuring that the populations in our countries now get the access to the medicines and vaccines that they need, but also creating that enabling environment for the generations and our children of tomorrow. So with that, I'll pass over to Tim to take us through some of the exciting findings in Mexico.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Jenner, for your presentation and for being here with us in this event. I would like to present the video of Dr. Tim Wilson.
Tim Wilson es responsable en liderar el sector de políticas de la práctica mundial de las ciencias de la vida. Ha completado estudios para la Comisión Europea y la industria farmacéutica sobre cómo reformar los mercados de atención médica para la eficiencia. También es responsable en liderar encargos de la Comisión Europea para una evaluación de crisis global de innovación y los riesgos de importación, además de ser conferencista internacional y experto en arbitrajes internacionales que involucra a empresas farmacéuticas multinacionales.
Thank you very much. Here with you, Dr. Tim Wilson.
Thank you very much for that introduction and the invitation to talk at this meeting today. As Andrew says, we all look forward to the time when we can do these meetings in person, but this is the next best thing. So the only thing that I suppose wasn't said in that introduction was we're economists. So CRA is a company of economists. We focus on life sciences and life sciences policy. But whereas Andrew very much comes from the legal and the IP perspective, I suppose what we're looking at is the value of innovation policy in the round. And hence, I suppose, economists have at some degree of a prism to look through that. So what I want to do over the next 20 minutes, I will keep the time, is to talk through this study we completed last year. So tell you a bit what it was trying to achieve and then talk you through some of the results and the findings. It's quite a long study, so I'm trying to entice you to read and go into the detail of the whole document. Let's see if I can move the slide. Right. Okay, so what were we trying to achieve? So what Interpat and EMIF asked us to do was to, rather than focus on kind of the weaknesses or the arguments of the past, was really to try to look to the future and identify and quantify what the economic benefits would be of strengthening the environment. So what would happen if we introduced a range of policies that have been introduced in other countries. So the project had 3 steps. First of all, to understand the policy framework in Mexico, and I'll talk about how we did that in a minute, and talk about some of the current challenges, some of the policy debates, which there was a very lively policy debate going on while we were doing this study. Secondly, was to say, well, as Andrew was suggesting, what can we learn from looking at other countries? Lots of other countries have faced similar challenges. Other countries have got things to learn from Mexico, but Mexico can learn from other countries as well. And slightly unusually, because we know there's a lot of focus of comparing markets within Latin America, we've chosen largely to look outside of Latin America. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but the principal one being some of these policies were introduced quite a long time ago, 5 or 10 years ago. So we've got a set of case studies where we can see what happened. And I'll talk you through that later on. And then we want to think about, well, what would this actually mean? We can always say this policy would be beneficial or this policy would be beneficial. What would it bring in terms of benefits? Can we put some quantum on that? We know it's speculative. Lots of other things happened. We hadn't predicted a pandemic. But can we put some quantum? How big would these things be? And can we look at where things offset? And Andrew already suggested employment is a very sensitive subject here. What's the net impact on employment? We've done similar studies in Argentina and Brazil. We learn every time. So I'm hoping some of the questions that we get later on in this session will help us with the Colombian study. There will always be bits that we can improve. I would also say we finished this study in the middle of 2020. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Fernando and Juan Carlos as to what's happened in the last year. We've obviously done a little bit of homework, but it'll be interesting to see if some of the policies we were looking at have evolved as expected. So that's what we were trying to do. The first thing to say is we weren't trying to start this from scratch. We weren't trying to do a first study of Mexico, because this is a debate. Lots of academic study has gone into innovation policy in Mexico already. So we give credit to many of the academic studies we've tried to build upon. There's lots of international or institutional reports as well, by MIF, by the Science and Innovation agencies, by different think tanks. And again, we've tried to draw on those. I suppose particularly relevant for Mexico, and particularly challenging in one way, was that we had this debate going on about the new intellectual property law, about the USMCA. And so we did look a lot at what the people were anticipating, predicting would happen. So the grey literature was particularly important in this as well. So hopefully in our work, you'll find useful references to the studies we've built on, as well as some useful data of our own. The second part is you can't learn everything from desk research. We obviously did this over the phone or by Zoom, unfortunately, but we did spend a lot of time interviewing experts who have worked for a long time and thought about innovation policy in Mexico. So we used the Interpat organization to understand the industry perspective, so the innovators' perspective on this. So we did 9 industry interviews with the local Mexican team and often the global team. And sometimes it was interesting hearing those two perspectives. We then did external interviews, trying to get a wide range of different viewpoints here, from the academic viewpoint to the science and innovation viewpoint to the health viewpoint. So we did manage to talk to the Science and Innovation Agency, other associations, particularly intellectual property, COFEPRES. We did have a very good discussion with the Jalisco Science Ministry with Larissa, who's also on this call, providing us with very useful input. So we understand. I'll come back to some of our observations on Jalisco a little bit later, but just to thank everyone who participated in these interviews. These are a really important part of it, because it's all very well data, but interpretation of data is often where the value is really added. So what was the framework we used? So it's a very simple framework. What this is saying is that innovation policy depends upon the policy environment, and this is kind of reprising some of the things Andrew just said. You do need a national policy, you do need targeted initiatives, and I'll come back to what some of those are. You've got the intellectual property part of this, you've got the free trade agreements part of this, so you need the policy framework, and there's a lot of experience on what is helpful for innovation. Secondly, you need the resources. Innovation builds on a skilled base to undertake scientific endeavor. So we need funding and foreign direct investment, funding from different markets, and obviously the skills base and the infrastructure to undertake healthcare science. So interacts with the clinical trial infrastructure and the healthcare environment. So you've got these two buckets at the top, which are often driven a lot by policy. And then you have the output of that activity. And this is partly innovation. So basic research, I'll come back to some of these metrics later on, clinical trials, patents, in some cases products, but I think we're looking at really innovative activity in this case. But on the other part of this is obviously the economic benefits. Innovation brings benefits in terms of the product of that innovation, but also the activity itself. So employment, trade, taxes. So we've tried to bring these together. So we're bringing this debate around industrial policy and the benefits of this, as well as innovation policy and healthcare, trying to bring this together in one framework. So the first part of this was to really set out the policy environment in Mexico. You could have gone back further, but clearly there's a long history of healthcare and innovation policy here. And you will see some things that we're going to come back to later on: technology transfer offices, data protection, public-private partnerships laws. And I suppose what this tells us by looking at the history is exactly the point Andrew made earlier on, that quite often some of the same issues have been addressed, but sometimes they get worse again after being addressed. So looking at the past is a useful place. So we spend some time summarizing some of the past efforts in terms of innovation policy. But a big focus of the study was to say, well, where are we now? And what are the associated weaknesses, if there are any, in terms of the innovation environment? And reviewing the literature, you commonly get these kind of 6 worries: infringement resolutions and the delays, regulatory data protection, the question about data exclusivity, patent linkages, provisions on patent term extensions. And I suppose what was very interesting during our project, and Fernando, thank you very much for helping us navigate some of these issues, was that many of these were at least partially addressed in the new IP law or the USMCA. And so we were very conscious as we were going through this project, not to say these were things that hadn't been identified, but still things we could quantify in terms of their benefits if they're implemented as hoped. So that was a challenge for this project, but a very interesting time to be doing this analysis, I suppose. Leaving aside those bits of legislation, I think throughout the interviews, with slightly different levels of viewpoint and nuances, of course, but we did find a lot of consistency across different stakeholders of some of the areas where the Mexican environment could be strengthened. So we've got clearly the lack of government incentives and the support for science and technology, and a real sense of it drifting over the last 5 years, and the need to re-energize some of those areas. Public-private partnerships, and this is a common issue we found in Argentina, we found in Brazil, is getting the interface between public and private to work well is difficult. But technology transfer offices is a key part of that. Obviously, Jalisco, I'll come back to later on, has a good story to tell there, but it's a challenging area for Mexico as a whole. And we've got the recognition of value, but I think probably more directly, we've got issues with clinical trial, the speed of regulatory acceptance, and an issue that we commonly have across many markets of poor communication, both between COFEPRIS and INPI, but also between the public and the government agencies. So we often hear this from the industry side. I suppose what was interesting is we heard this from a range of stakeholders. So there did seem to be quite a degree of consistency in the diagnosis of the issue. But the interesting part of our study, hopefully, is to say, well, how could we improve from here? So this is the busiest of busy slides, I know. I'm not going to go through any of the data. I had lots of slides I could have gone through, but just look at this as a blur, and then I'll tell you what some of the interesting findings were. And looking at the data, it's clearly the case that the level of R&D expenditure in Mexico is not completely out of line with Latin America, much lower than the OECD, but the problem is the last 5 years, that seems to have been going in the wrong direction, and much more of it comprised of public than private than you would like to see. In terms of the skills resources, as Andrew said, there's a lot of strength here, both in terms of the quality of the university, and we might hear a bit more about that later on, but also just the general skills of the population. PISA ratings are very good, looking both internationally at the OECD level and at the Latin American level. If you look at innovative activity in terms of clinical trials, patents, etc., there are issues clearly with the clinical trial numbers are actually reasonably positive, but the composition of those is worrying. Not much early stage clinical trial activity, and an issue with collaboration in terms of authorship of articles. So there clearly are some real strengths here, but also some areas of concern. And if you look at employment, a strong compared to some of the Latin American comparisons, but a concern that it's stagnating. So the report goes through this in some detail. I haven't got time to do it today, but I wanted to give you a sense. There are real numbers underlying this analysis, and you can find them in the full report. What is clear, and I suppose I wanted to emphasize, partly to Larissa, we heard very well from the discussion we had last year, that we need to be careful looking at averages across the whole of Mexico as well. There clearly are stronger parts in terms of the regional clusters. Jalisco being a very good example of this, but not the only example, where we have Ministry of Innovation incorporating an IP office. We have technology transfer with the public-private partnerships between universities. Looks like it's working very well, even though there's real concerns across other parts of Mexico. There are really some examples of success here. And I suppose what we took this to mean, and hopefully interpreted correctly, is it's not all about rules and regulations. It's about also culture and enthusiasm and effort. And often the rules don't actually stop these things happening, but you still need to work with the universities to make sure there are not regulations blocking public-private partnerships, which is destroying the value of basic research if it means that it's not getting translated into innovation. So we heard the JALISCO story, and it's a very strong one, and we tried to incorporate that into the report and some of the findings. So you end up with this baseline where Mexico has many strong parts in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the university-based employment, and to some degree the interaction with the healthcare system, but then has some weaknesses when we start to look at R&D investment, publications, particularly co-authored publications across countries, clinical trials. So we find this case that the infrastructure and the capacity is stronger than the innovation outputs or the economic outputs. This is common across the other markets we've looked at in terms of Argentina and Brazil. There's just an unexploited infrastructure that we could use for innovation. So what we do in the report is to set out those challenges, set where Mexico was, admittedly this is in the summer of 2020, and then say, well, if that's where we are today with some of the trends ongoing, what would happen if we addressed some of those weaknesses in the innovation environment? And here's where the case study approach comes in really useful. So what we're looking for is similar markets. You'll see that's quite challenging, but where the government has prioritized innovation policies, we can see a clear policy. We were also interested, I suppose, because of the situation of Mexico, in where that's been implemented through a free trade agreement and come about through that kind of process, which affects timelines and etc. And we were interested in looking at markets where the policy had happened long enough ago that we could say, well, can we observe the impact? And we've got enough literature to say, was the policy actually instrumental in that impact, which is obviously another big impact, a big worry if you're an economist, kind of saying, is it correlation or causation? So we ended up using a range of cases, building on some of the case studies we've used in Argentina and Brazil if they were still relevant, but also introducing new case studies that were particularly pertinent for the situation in Mexico. So we ended up using these countries on the right-hand side. What you'll see is, yes, they are quite different in terms of the size of the population. It's difficult to compare China to anywhere, given that its relative size. But if you look at them as a group of countries and you look for consistent results across them, you can reassure yourself that the policy is driving the indicator. We also then tried to look for studies which gave us some sense of causation. So we tried to deal with that issue in two ways. So we ended up with Denmark and China as kind of a turning point on government prioritization. So have they decided to change course, focus on prioritization, introduce a new national plan, introduce a set of coherent policies. We're interested in Singapore, particularly around the role of free trade agreements, the infringement of resolutions. That seems to be an interesting comparison. We used a range of countries on patent linkage, which is an interesting policy, and then a lot of countries on RDP, because I think that's been a common issue across the studies we've done so far. So we're kind of gathering up case studies that have looked at that issue. So we've drawn upon these different case studies to say what would happen if. And this is another busy slide. But what we then say, well, let's be a bit cautious here. If we take that whole set of case studies and we choose these points in time, what kind of benefit can we see from it across these different indicators? And then if we take the case studies that are specific, we obviously get down to 2 or 3 quite often. Can we see a change in the number of clinical trials or the inflection point in basic research and patents? And there's lots of this, a model So we need to take some of these assumptions as assumptions, but you can observe in quite a lot of these markets, differential growth rates. You can spend a bit of time worrying about the inflection point, but you can definitely observe it. And then you say, well, what happens if we applied this to the Mexican scenario? And this is where your baseline data becomes very useful. We've done this in different ways in different countries, depending on what was useful. I suppose what we ended up doing in Mexico was to say, well, if 5 years ago we started thinking about doing this, is where we see the inflection point in some of the data. What would have happened if? So we look at this for basic research, clinical trials, patents, employment, and you're really trying to say, well, what would happen if you introduced these policies? Would you see employment drop because it puts a restriction on the generic industry and you don't get a offsetting improvement in employment for the innovative industry? And what you tend to find is, yes, you see a benefit in all these indicators. The biggest one is clinical trials and patents. That kind of makes sense. You do see publications, but that's a slow-moving beast, so it takes some time to do. The pharma industry does go up, but only a marginal amount. You've got a big industry already in Mexico. One more slide, luckily. So what do we conclude? We conclude Mexico's got a lot going for it in terms of innovation capacity. So there's real infrastructure to build on. But as you start to compare it to the OECD or Latin American benchmarks, there really is some room for improvement, and you can think about seeing some of the success we saw in Asia. So we would hope to see improvements in basic research, clinical trial activity, and a modest improvement in employment. What do we need to do that? Well, we need to follow through on the intellectual property law, make sure it happens in practice and happens as early as possible, reaffirming regulatory data protection, and then some of the softer side, getting communication to work, getting legal certainty around tech transfer. But the biggest one is probably at the bottom, making sure we have this ongoing and positive commitment to innovation. And that's where you can start to see these turning points in the data. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to comments and the discussion from the other speakers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tim Wilson. And I remind the audience that the questions will be held at the end of the conference. And I appreciate really your time, Dr. Wilson. And let's start with the next part of the conference. Okay. Vamos a iniciar con nuestro segundo bloque de conferencias en la que vamos a dar la conferencia Oportunidades y Retos en la Innovación Mexicana para la Salud. Como primer ponente, tenemos al doctor Fernando Portugal, Dr. Fernando, he is the Director of Intellectual Property in Él es licenciado en Derecho por la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de Morelos y máster en Derecho de los Negocios por la Universidad Francisco de Victoria en Madrid, España. De 2005 a 2018, from 2005 to 2018, he was a public officer, public servant at the Ministry of Economics, and in the Mexican Institute of Intellectual Property, he was part of the Mexican negotiation session of the intellectual property, and he was also part of the negotiations between the modernized free trade agreement between Mexico and the European Union. He has been the Director of Intellectual Property and the Mexican Association of Pharmaceutical Research Industries, where he coordinates all the efforts with the pharmaceutical industry, and this is to have the best legal and regulatory environment in Mexico and in the region for the development of new beneficial drugs for medicines for the benefit of the Mexican population. Let's welcome Dr. Fernando Portugal. You have the floor over, doctor, so that you can start with your presentation.
Por esta presentación tan amable. Específicamente quisiera agradecer a Margarita Hernández, a la Universidad de Guadalajara y, por supuesto, a Larisa Cruz Ornelas de la Secretaría de de la Secretaría de Innovación, Ciencia y Tecnología del Estado de Jalisco por esta oportunidad de estar discutiendo y hablando acerca de los retos, pero también las importantes oportunidades que el Estado mexicano tiene en materia de innovación farmacéutica. Aprovecho para felicitar a Larisa, que recientemente ha sido nombrada como Directora General de Ciencia y Desarrollo Tecnológico. La verdad es que ya le comentaba yo a ella en privado que es una decisión absolutamente lógica, que en realidad pues todos estamos muy conscientes de su trabajo, de su compromiso y de su entusiasmo por la innovación. Entonces, pues enhorabuena, pero nos da mucho gusto, pero no nos extraña en lo más mínimo. Yo creo que ha sido la mejor decisión que se pudo haber tomado. Bueno, pues entrando un tanto en materia, sí quisiéramos comentar un poquito porque estamos muy emocionados y muy contentos por el hecho de estar aquí siendo o en la casa de la Universidad de Guadalajara en el estado de Jalisco. Este estado está ampliamente vinculado a la propiedad intelectual a nivel internacional. Pero, obviamente, el aspecto de propiedad intelectual más conocido del Estado, en el entorno tanto nacional como internacional, está inscrito en el contexto de las indicaciones geográficas y de las denominaciones de origen. De aquí es originario el tequila. Y pues esta denominación de origen es una de las bebidas, si no es que la más famosa de México, y gran parte del éxito económico que este Estado ha tenido, pues obedece a esa vinculación tan fuerte con esta bebida espirituosa que ha tenido un éxito descomunal en los últimos años. Y aquí nada más una nota anecdótica para Tim y para Andrew, uno de los primeros lugares en donde el tequila empezó a consumirse como una bebida habitual fue en las representaciones diplomáticas del Reino Unido. A partir de ahí, esto habrá sido a principios de los años 80, comenzó el éxito de esta bebida, que obviamente está sustentado por la calidad de ese producto y también por toda la labor que en materia de propiedad intelectual ha venido realizando el Consejo Regulador del Tequila y, por supuesto, el Estado de Jalisco. Pero no solamente se queda ahí la relación de Jalisco con la propiedad intelectual. Durante los últimos años, desde el gobierno del Estado, se ha impulsado un programa de políticas públicas muy importante para fomentar la innovación, pero ya en el campo de la propiedad industrial, en materia patentable. Anteriormente, durante mucho tiempo, Jalisco no estaba en el top 10, ni siquiera en el top 5 de los estados con mayor número de solicitudes de patente en México. Actualmente es el segundo. Después de la Ciudad de México, Jalisco es el estado de donde proceden más solicitudes de patentes y en donde, bueno, y desde el cual también, por supuesto, hay más patentes otorgadas. Y esto pues tiene mucho que ver con las políticas públicas de varias administraciones y por supuesto de esta, por estar fomentando el desarrollo de la ciencia y de la tecnología. Entonces, bien podemos decir que la marca personal, la marca, digamos, de carácter del estado de Jalisco y muy específicamente de la ciudad de Guadalajara está también ahora muy relacionada con las patentes, con las invenciones, y esperemos que esta influencia salga, perdón. Me están pidiendo que ponga en off mi canal de traducción, está en off, está apagado. No sé si tenga que hacer otra cosa. Bueno, en fin. Bueno, esperemos que esta influencia del Estado de Jalisco pues permee en el resto de México. La cuestión optimista es que mucha de la cultura jalisciense pues ha influenciado al resto de México y muchas de las cosas que en el mundo se consideran como la quinta esencia de la mexicanidad en realidad fueron originadas en el Estado de Jalisco, en Guadalajara.
live in the state of Jalisco, in the city of
en el
Guadalajara,
mundo entero, es una
mariachi
producción
band,
cultural
we are
de este estado.
identified by
Esperemos que el mismo camino
the mariachi
se
band,
siga
and
con
we
lo que
hope
tiene
the
que ver
same
con la promoción
happens with the
a
promotion
la
of
innovación y al
innovation
desarrollo de
and the
nuevos
promotion
productos
of
y
the development
procesos
of
que
new
puedan
products and
ser
processes that
susceptibles de ser
would be
protegidos por patente.
that can be protected.
Pasamos, por favor, a la siguiente.
Now let's go to the next
A la siguiente lámina.
slide. The next
Ya entrando
slide,
un tanto
please.
en materia, a nosotros nos ha
Speaking about
parecido
the
muy
main part of
interesante
the
desde el
presentation,
principio,
we believe it is
desde
very
que empezamos
interesting
a
since the beginning, since
conocer
we first
acerca
started
del
to know
proyecto
about the
que
project
tenía en ciernes Interpat
that
y Charles River,
Interpat and Charles
el
River was
enfoque
starting.
que se
What
le
they
pretendía dar al
were
estudio
starting
sobre
was the
México
approach.
y que
The
estaba
approach
totalmente
for
enfocado también
Mexico,
en
and
los
the
efectos
study was
positivos que
focused on the
la
positive
propiedad
effects
intelectual y la
of
innovación
intellectual
pueden
property
tener
and
para
of
la salud.
innovation, what
En
these
este
two can bring
terreno,
to health.
pues ya
Speaking
se ha
about
hablado
this,
mucho, se ha
we have
convertido
spoken a
incluso en
lot,
un
and
lugar
it has
común
even
el
it is a
referir
commonplace
que
to
la
make a
innovación, que la
reference
propiedad
to innovation
intelectual
and
es el
to
secreto
speak
para el
about innovation
desarrollo
and
y
to
para el
say
éxito
that
económico.
intellectual property is the secret
Esto es algo ya
for
muy
the
sabido, de
development
una
and for the
forma u otra
economic
todos los
growth, and this is
países
something
intentan
very well
desarrollar
known.
políticas
All countries are
públicas
trying to
que
develop public
fomenten la
policies
actividad creativa
to
en el campo de la
promote
ciencia,
creative
pero
activity in
tenemos
the fields of
mucha
science.
evidencia
And we
empírica
have a
de
lot of
que
empirical
no
evidence
solamente la
that shows
economía,
that it is
no
not only the economy,
solamente
it is
la
not only
cuestión de clima de
the
inversión puede o
investment,
tiene un efecto
the
directamente
effect
asociado a la
that is
protección de la
directly
propiedad
related
intelectual y
to
a la
the
innovación.
enforcement
También
or
vemos
protection of intellectual
que hay
property and
datos
innovation.
que nos
We also
arrojan
see, and there is a
que
data
la
that
propiedad intelectual,
says
que la innovación también
that
tienen una
innovation,
repercusión positiva en el
an
desarrollo
intellectual
social,
property will have a positive
en un
influence in the
campo
social
en el cual
development,
la salud
in a field
tiene
where
una
health
importancia fundamental.
plays a very
Cuando
important
nosotros
role.
tomamos el
When we
índice global de
take
innovación,
the global
este
index
indicador
of
de la ONU que
innovation, which is the
valora y que
United Nations
considera
indicator
muchos
that
factores para
values and considers many
calificar
factors in
de
order
cierta
to
forma
score, to
el
somehow score
desarrollo
the
de un país
development
o el nivel de
of
vida
a
de un país
country or
y
the
lo
level of
comparamos
life,
con
the lifestyle of a country.
el índice
And then
global de
when we
innovación,
compare it to
que
the
es
global
una
index of
clasificación que
innovation,
hace la
which is a
OMPI al respecto
classification by
de
the
qué tan innovadores son
WIPO,
los países,
to speak about
pues
how
encontramos
innovative
que
countries are, we
tenemos
find
más o menos a
that
los
we
mismos
have
países en
more
una
or less
lista
the
y en
same
otra,
countries in
¿no?
one and in the
Vemos
other
que,
list.
por
In
ejemplo,
both
Suiza,
lists,
que
we
de
have the
acuerdo a
same
la OMPI
countries.
es el
We see
país con
Switzerland, and
mayor
according
grado
to
de
WIPO,
innovación,
it is the
pues
country with the
en cuanto a
highest
nivel de vida,
degree of
según la ONU,
innovation.
ocupa
And then,
el lugar número
speaking about the
3.
level of
Aquí
life, it is
únicamente
in the third
estamos dejando a
rank.
los
It
10
ranks
primeros
third.
lugares.
Here we
Sin
have
embargo,
only
si
the top 10
fuéramos hasta los
ranks.
20, hasta los 30, que
But
son
if
los que
we
están
see
clasificados
20
como
or
de alto
even
desarrollo
30
humano,
ranks, which
pues
are
vamos
the
a ver
ones
que son los
classified
mismos
as
personajes.
high human
Prácticamente
development, we're
se
going to see the
intercambian
same
los que tienen
countries.
más innovación
Only
con los
some
que al
countries will have more
mismo tiempo,
innovation
y
and
repito,
others
según
will
los
have,
indicadores de la ONU,
and this is
tienen
according to the
mejor
United Nations
calidad de vida.
indicators.
Entonces, con
The
estos
countries with the
datos, con esta
highest level
información,
of
tenemos
lifestyle. So with this information, with this data,
podemos tener una
we
conclusión
can
empírica
have
de
an
que
empiric, we can
hay
draw
una
an empiric
conexión
conclusion
entre
that there
la
is a
innovación
relationship
protegida
between
a través de la
innovation
propiedad intelectual
protected and
y
intellectually
el
protected
estado de
innovation
bienestar
and
de
the
la
state
población,
and
en
the
el que,
status of
insisto,
well-being of the
la salud
population,
es un
where I
elemento
insist
importante.
health is an important
Pasamos a la
element.
siguiente, por favor.
Now let's go to the next one, please.
Ya siendo más específicos
Now,
en
if we
cuanto
are
a
more
derechos de propiedad
specific, speaking
intelectual
about
y en
intellectual property
cuanto
rights, and if
a
we speak
cuestiones
about
que midan la salud en los
aspects
países,
to measure
podemos
health
tomar
in the
datos
different
tanto
countries,
de la
we
OMC
can take
como otra vez
information from the
del Global
World
Innovation
Trade
Index
Organization
y
and from the
otros
Global Innovation
indicadores que miden
Index.
el
We
desempeño de
can
los
also
países
use
en
other
cuanto a la
indicators that
protección de
measure
las
the
patentes.
performance of
Sí
countries
tengo que
in
aclarar,
speaking
no
about
solamente
protection of
patentes
patents,
farmacéuticas,
not only
sino
pharmaceutical
también
patents. I would like to make this
patentes
clarification, but
en
also speaking
general.
about patents
Y
in
por
general
favor,
terms. And
hago
please,
aquí un breve
I would
paréntesis,
like
le
to also
pido
make a
a nuestra
parenthesis,
traductora que
and
si
I
estoy
ask
hablando muy rápido en español, me lo
translator that if
indiquen,
I am speaking
porque
very
yo
fast
hablo
in
demasiado
Spanish,
rápido, entonces a
to
lo
let
mejor
me
ya
know,
tenemos
because
a
I
nuestra
sometimes
traductora
speak
aquí
very,
a punto de la
very fast,
asfixia,
and maybe our
entonces, por favor,
translator
con
is
toda
about
confianza,
to
nada más que,
choke,
inclusive si es necesario, pues interrúmpanme
please
por aquí,
tell me.
porque ya luego yo
And if necessary, please interrupt
sigo de
me. But
largo
I
y no
think
veo
I am
mensajes.
managing.
Bueno,
I would say I am
el El caso es que vemos que en los países que tienen mayor expectativa de vida, que sus habitantes tienen el beneficio de contar con insumos para la salud que les permiten alcanzar edades muy avanzadas y en buenas condiciones, otra vez al mismo tiempo, son los que tienen mejor desempeño en cuanto a la protección de patentes. En este caso, pues sí es muy importante aclarar, por supuesto que una buena política de salud pública, el acceso a la salud no es únicamente un tema de innovación, por supuesto no solamente tiene que ver con protección a derechos de propiedad intelectual, entra un conjunto de políticas públicas que tienen que aplicarse para que esto se logre. Por ejemplo, el objetivo de contar con servicios públicos, con servicios gubernamentales que garanticen una cobertura universal, como en el caso de México, tenemos desde la Constitución el deber de que el Estado garantice el acceso a la salud. También está el ISSSTE, está el IMSS, está el INSABI, que se encargan de materializar esa garantía, ese derecho humano. Sin embargo, con la información que contamos, podemos decir con toda certeza que en cualquier caso la propiedad intelectual y los altos estándares de protección a través de patentes, a través de secreto industrial, a través de protección de datos, no son de ninguna manera un obstáculo para que se logre la protección de la salud. Y que inclusive puede haber evidencia de que hasta la impulsen, la fomenten de forma importante. Aquí les hemos dado los ejemplos positivos, sin embargo, y nos da mucha tristeza porque se trata de ejemplificar a veces con países hermanos, vemos que otros países que han tenido o que mantienen niveles de protección bajos a la propiedad intelectual, incluso en el entorno latinoamericano, pues al mismo tiempo no es que ello haya generado un acceso de medicamentos o un exceso de o la entrada de tratamientos innovadores a sus territorios. Los países que en América Latina tienen, digamos, o son conocidos por tener bajos estándares de protección a la propiedad industrial, al mismo tiempo son los que tienen el desempeño más bajo en lo que hace a garantizar el acceso a la protección a la salud. Entonces, pues de ninguna manera podemos considerar que la propiedad intelectual, que los sistemas de patentes puedan estar afectando el derecho humano a tener un entorno que permita desarrollarnos también adecuadamente en materia sanitaria. Y pasamos, por favor, a la siguiente. Bueno, durante la excelente plática de Andrew y de Jim, estuvimos escuchando acerca de las fortalezas y también de las debilidades que México puede tener o que México enfrenta. Otro de los puntos que a mí realmente me resulta muy interesante del análisis tan exhaustivo que ellos han hecho es lo referente a la capacidad académica, a la infraestructura de investigación científica que tenemos en México. Tal y como yo lo he confirmado con la introducción que di a estas palabras, pues los mexicanos tenemos mucho orgullo por toda nuestra producción cultural. Estamos muy convencidos, forma parte de la identidad nacional, de nuestra música, nuestra literatura y la cinematografía, que son formas de creatividad humana directamente relacionadas con la propiedad intelectual, forman parte importante de nuestra cultura. Y no solamente estamos muy seguros de ello, también lo presumimos y es prácticamente parte del ADN cultural en nuestro país.
DNA,
el caso
DNA of
es
our
que
country.
no ocurre lo mismo con la ciencia y
But
con la tecnología.
with science
No
and
hay
technology,
esa
it doesn't
vinculación
happen. There
cultural.
is no
Pero eso
cultural
no
relationship
significa
with science and
que
technology.
en
But it
México
doesn't
no
mean that in Mexico
tengamos
we do not
científicos,
have
que no tengamos
scientists. It doesn't mean we do
universidades
not
como
have
la Universidad de
universities. It
Guadalajara,
doesn't
como la
mean we do
UNAM,
not
como
have
el TEC de Monterrey,
scientists or
con capacidad
universities such as
equivalente
UNAM
a la
and
de
the
otros
University of
países
Guadalajara
o a la de
universities
países
with a capacity
desarrollados.
that can be
Lo que hace
compared to the
falta, y
capacity of
esto es
other
algo que
developed
el
countries.
estudio
What we're
revela
missing,
y que
and this
también
is
me parece una
something we saw in
conclusión
this study, and
tremendamente
it seems to be
importante,
a very important
es
conclusion, is that
que donde hay que poner el énfasis es en el
we need to
contacto
emphasize
entre ese sector
the
académico, ese
contact
sector de
between this
investigación
economic
y
sector, this
la,
research sector. This is
y la
precisely
empresa.
where we need
La
to
empresa
focus, and the
establecida en México,
enterprise,
ya
the
sea a través de
well-established
inversiones, la empresa nacional.
enterprise
Es
in Mexico,
ahí
the domestic
donde está
enterprise,
el
through
punto que nos falta
investments, for
para
example.
ser
This
una
is exactly
potencia
where we have
tecnológica
the missing
importante, no
element in
solamente en el
order to
ramo de la
become an
salud, sino en
important
muchos otros.
technological element
Ahora bien,
country, not only in health, but in many other fields.
pasando un poquito
Now,
ya al tema que
speaking about
ha
the
acaparado
main
la
topic
atención
that
de
has the
la población
attention
mundial durante los
of the world
últimos
population
tiempos, que es el
in recent
COVID-19,
times, which is the
uno de los efectos más
COVID-19.
importantes
One
que
of
nos
the
ha
most
traído es
important effects we
acelerar la
have had
digitalización
is the
y las
acceleration of
comunicaciones remotas.
digitalization and remote
Cuando
communications.
uno ve cómo era
When
la vida
you
laboral en
see how
2019,
was
pareciera que ya
labor
pasó
life
una
in
eternidad,
2019,
que ha pasado
it
un
seems
siglo.
that
Pero
it's been a
esta
century ago.
utilización exhaustiva de
This
herramientas
exhaustive
electrónicas
use
también
of
se ha
electronic
trasladado al
tools
campo de la salud.
has
Y es algo que
transferred to
hemos
the
visto
field of
en
health,
varios
and this is
países, que
something
hemos
we've
visto que se
seen
ha
in
estado dando
several
de forma
countries.
natural.
We've
Y esto
seen
nos
that
habla
this is
de que la
happening
innovación, que la
naturally, and it
investigación en
tells us
salud
that
en los
innovation
próximos
and
años
health
no solamente
research
estará
in
centrada
the
en
years to
cuestiones
come will not
farmacéuticas,
only
sino también en
focus on
dispositivos
the
electrónicos,
pharmaceutical
también en
companies,
cuestiones
but also
tecnológicas. Y es
technological
aquí
elements
donde
and medical
muchos de los
devices, and
hallazgos
this
que
is
se encontraron en el
precisely where
estudio
many of the
también se tendrán que
findings that were
aplicar,
found in
también
this study
tendrá
will
que
be
fomentarse la
used.
innovación aquí en México para que podamos
Innovation
llegar
has to be
a
promoted in
tener
Mexico.
Un estatus de investigación tecnológica equivalente al tamaño de nuestra economía, que forma parte del top 20 mundial. Es muy interesante, por supuesto, constatar y ver la experiencia de países más desarrollados que el nuestro, de países que tienen mejor calidad de vida de acuerdo a indicadores objetivos de la ONU, pero también no solamente debemos concentrarnos en estos ejemplos para ver cosas buenas. También podemos voltear a ver lo que pasa en otros países. En un libro que ahora estoy leyendo que se llama 2030 de Mauro Guillén, citan por ejemplo el caso de Kenia, de cómo inclusive antes de la pandemia el país tuvo que descansar gran parte de sus servicios médicos en recursos de transmisión electrónica, en el uso extensivo de las aplicaciones que ahora tenemos en los teléfonos, en la tablet, en la computadora, para dar seguimiento a la salud. Esto, por supuesto, en Kenia y potencialmente en México y en cualquier otro país, pues también generará una actividad innovativa importante relacionada con la salud, y es algo que tendremos que estar viendo y que tiene relación muy directa con muchas de las recomendaciones que el estudio de Interpat hace para nuestro país y sobre las que quisiera recapitular un poquito más. Siguiente lámina, por favor. Realmente el Interpat, además de recordarnos esa infraestructura, esa capacidad de investigación que tienen nuestros científicos en México, que hace falta ponerlo en contacto con el mundo empresarial, también tiene un énfasis importante en la estructura legal de México, en el régimen jurídico mexicano. Y acá, pues, sale a colación otro de los temas que en los últimos 2 o 3 años también ha acaparado la atención del público en nuestro país, que es el TEMEC, que por cierto, por estos días estamos celebrando su primer aniversario tras su entrada en vigor. Este tratado pone a México pues en el nivel más alto que hay en el mundo en lo que toca a los estándares
about the
protección de la
standards
propiedad
of
intelectual,
enforcement of
los cuales
intellectual
deben ser
property.
implementados,
And this is to be
obviamente,
implemented.
en nuestra
Obviously,
legislación
this is to
nacional
be
para que puedan
implemented in
ser
our national
efectivos.
legislation
También
to
tenemos
be
una ley
effective,
federal de
and we also
protección de la
have a
propiedad
federal
industrial
law
que
of
también
protection
está
of
cumpliendo
industrial
un año
property
de
that is
haber sido
celebrating
promulgada por
also
estas
1
fechas.
year
Entró en
of
vigor
being
un
enacted.
poquito
It
después,
was enacted a
hasta
little bit
a
after
finales de
the
año, pero
USMCA. It was enacted at the
se
end of the year
publicó en
of
nuestro diario
2020,
oficial
but it was published
también
in
el
our
1 de
official
julio de
gazette
2020.
on July
Estamos
the
también
1st of
a un año de
2020.
su aprobación.
It's been also 1 year
Vamos,
after it
si
was
se leen
passed.
tanto el TEMEC
And if
como
you read
la nueva ley de
USMCA,
propiedad
and if
industrial,
you read
pues
the new law of
encontraremos
industrial property,
que
the new law
estándares
of industrial
de
property, you are
protección a
going
las
to find
patentes, de protección a la
standards to
innovación
protect
farmacéutica
patents, to
muy
protect
altos.
pharmaceutical innovation,
Pero,
very
pues,
high
lo
standards.
importante es
But
que
what
ellos
matters
se
the
apliquen,
most
que
is that they need
tengamos
to
a las autoridades
apply
seriamente
them. We need to have
comprometidas con
authorities
la
seriously
adecuada
committed to the adequate
observancia de
compliance and
esas
enforcement of
disposiciones.
those provisions.
Y otro dato que es muy importante es que pues
And
la
another very important piece of
implementación
information
doméstica, la
is
adopción de
that
las
the
leyes y
domestic
reglamentos que se
implementation, adoption
necesitan
of laws and
para
regulations needed.
cumplir con el TEMEC no ha terminado. El
This
1 de
is
julio,
not
como les
complete
comentaba,
yet.
del año
On
pasado,
July
pues
the 1st, as I
tuvimos
already
nuestra
told
nueva
you,
ley de
last
propiedad
year we
industrial,
had the new
pero hay
law of
ciertas
industrial
medidas
property,
y muy específicamente
but there are some
relacionadas con la
measures
innovación
specifically
farmacéutica
related to pharmaceutical
y que
innovation.
además el estudio de Interpat
And
recomienda
the
adoptar por
Interpat
los
study
beneficios que pueden
recommends
traer a
to
la salud
adopt
y a la
because of the
inversión
benefit it can bring
que
to
están
health and to
previstas en el
investment.
TEMEC. Y tenemos hasta 2025 para implementarlas. No
And we
es
have till the year
que se tenga que agotar
2025 to
ese plazo,
implement
puede ser
this.
antes, pero
We
a
can
más tardar
also
tendrá que ser en ese
implement
año.
all this
Y esto
before
tiene un
2025, but the
matiz
deadline
importante
is
también. Más allá
2025.
de los
And there
beneficios
is
que
an
estas medidas
important, and
traen
apart from the
a
benefits
México,
brought by these
pues
measures
también
to Mexico,
el TEMEC, a diferencia de otros tratados
USMCA, unlike
internacionales y
other
otros tratados de libre
international treaties
comercio,
and unlike
tendrá una
other
revisión
free
integral
trade
en
agreements, will have
2026,
a
es decir, un
comprehensive
año
review in
después de
2026.
que
In other
se
words, a year
expiren los
later,
periodos de
after
transición
the
que hay
transition
para
periods are due
implementar domésticamente las
for
obligaciones de
the
TEMEC
domestic
pendientes.
implementation of the
En
pending
ese 2026
USMCA
se podrá
obligations. In the year
decidir si el
2026, it will be
tratado
possible to
se
decide whether
renueva.
or
El
not
TEMEC,
the
digamos que tiene una
treaty
fecha de
is renewed.
caducidad
It has an
para
expiration date,
para
which is
2036. A partir de 2026, pues
2036,
cada
and
año se
as
estarán
of the
reuniendo las
year
partes para ver si este se
2026,
renueva.
on a yearly basis, the parties will
Hasta
meet
aquí
in order to
me
determine
quedaría
if
yo.
the treaty is going to
Agradezco
be renewed.
nuevamente
This is the end of my
a la
presentation, and I would
Secretaría
like to thank again
de
the
Innovación,
Ministry of
Ciencia y
Innovation
Desarrollo
and
Tecnológico, así
Science
como la
and
Universidad de Guadalajara.
Technological
Y otra
Development
vez, un
and the
gusto, un
University of
placer, un
Guadalajara.
privilegio
And again,
estar
it's been
aquí
my
con
pleasure. It's been a
Andrew
privilege to
y
be
con
here
Tim,
with you, with Andrew, with
refiriéndonos
Tim,
a este
and to
importante
have the
estudio para nuestro
possibility to
país.
speak about this very important study for our country.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Fernando. Ahora voy a pasar el video de presentación
Now we're going to play the clip
Juan Carlos
of Dr.
Trujillo.
Juan Carlos Trujillo.
Y un instante.
Juan Carlos Trujillo es médico y oftalmólogo de la Universidad del Rosario. Es máster en Administración de Empresas de la Universidad de los Andes de Colombia. Tiene 13 años de experiencia en la industria farmacéutica de vacunas PIPARA, donde desde el 2015 se desempeña como director de operaciones y política internacional. Antes de vincularse al sector privado, trabajó como secretario privado del ministro de Educación, director general de política de Recursos Humanos del Ministerio de Salud y asesor en salud del Ministerio de Defensa de Colombia. Juan Carlos.
Pues démosle un aplauso al doctor Juan
Let's
Carlos.
welcome Dr. Juan Carlos Trujillo. He's going to start his presentation. Thanks, Dr. Juan Carlos, for being with us. You have the floor over. Thanks for this very nice introduction. I am very pleased to be In this forum, I would like to especially express my gratitude to the University of Guadalajara and to the Secretariat of Innovation, Science and Technology of the state of Jalisco in this very interesting opportunity to share the result of this study. And it is my honor to be in this event and to be with Andrew and with Tim because they made a very significant contribution from FIPARA. In FIPARA, we have followed up the study in Argentina and in Brazil, and we are waiting to see the study from Colombia and about Colombia, and we believe we will have an amazing opportunity to improve in order to pursue the objective that we all want to attain, which is the well-being of patients all over the world. And in this case, in Mexico, the well-being of Mexico. I am also very pleased to share this panel with Fernando Portugal, a good friend of mine, a colleague, and he has been a support for all our objectives. Very briefly, I also would like to come to present the regional vision and in a global vision. I would like to present the regional and the global vision after to the of this report, and we're very, very pleased to have these results now. Very quickly, I will share some of the topics that we believe at the Federation of the Latin American pharmaceutical industry. What has been the contribution of intellectual property in this topic of the COVID or coronavirus pandemic? And I have also some short considerations speaking about the industry, the global aspect of the industry in this very challenging episode that we are facing. There are some reasons of why we can work in this context so that we can improve health worldwide. There, I will be presenting some reflections about the study that was made with Pugan Concilium, which is a biopharmaceutical competitiveness survey. It is a survey about biopharmaceutical competitiveness and investment, which aligns with the results presented by Tim. And then we're going to open the space to some additional reflections. So the contribution of intellectual property during the pandemic at this point in time, and this could be somehow extrapolated to other fields of health. And as Fernando said, it could be extrapolated in many other fields, to many other fields. Intellectual property has allowed us to collaborate, to clearly collaborate to the diagnosis. And the diagnosis of COVID, coronavirus, and the pandemic, it has allowed us to determine the presence of the virus in the populations through the development of programs in order to expedite the diagnosis tests, and with the alliances and the collaboration with governments and with the regional multilateral organizations for the development of this diagnosis tests. Prevention has been very important. As said since the beginning, the ecosystem with a tool which is intellectual property, this has allowed the development of vaccines, the quick development of vaccines before the coronavirus vaccine. The vaccine that was developed most quickly took 4 years its development. So this environment that intellectual and intellectual property allow has allowed to have this very important achievement or development. And this is why we now have the possibility to have more than 382 vaccines under development, and the previous experience has been used, the experience with other diseases and with other developments in order to develop vaccines. And this is why we have almost 10 global vaccines available to the population. Now, speaking about the treatment or the existing drugs or medications, the development of approved medications for the diseases has been improved, and this could bring a benefit to all those patients with COVID. coronavirus. So it is possible to make an implementation. It is possible to implement all these health solutions with the existing antibiotics in order to have better results to deal with the pandemic. How can we describe the role of intellectual property? We continue with the facilities that have allowed the manufacturing and the distribution of drugs and vaccines. We are focused on prevention, as we said before. We focus on vaccines, but we should also take into consideration the development of medicines in order to deal with this high impact disease that is affecting the whole mankind. So this is going to be developed with the floor of a well-established intellectual property, as mentioned by those who spoke before me, and by increasing the manufacturing of the existing medical medicines to fight the virus, investing in infrastructure to expedite the manufacturing, to guarantee the quick distribution and to have continuity in the production chains and highly efficient supply chain. All this has been developed thanks to the platform that is being used today. Speaking about treatment and prevention, we have almost 400 vaccines being developed with retrovirals and candidates of vaccines with innovating techniques such as the messaging RNA, ARM. And now speaking about how we can contribute in general terms to the industry, how can we contribute to the industry during this time of pandemic, considering and having the floor of intellectual property. After more than 12 months, we have the development of all the vaccines we already spoke about. In the pharmaceutical industry, $76.8 million have been invested in order to do research and the development of these vaccines that have been given to low income and medium income countries. And there is more than 3 vaccines already approved by the World Health Organization, by the IFMA. The IFMA is the Global Association of the Pharmaceutical Industry, located in Switzerland, and there are 6 vaccines till now being clinically developed, and more than 260 agreements to produce and to manufacture COVID vaccines around the globe. With all these reflections in general terms about the pandemic, we can make a consideration, we can consider intellectual property per se as a player of the global health system at the local and at the regional level. Why is it that we believe intellectual property is important in order to maximize the health results in health? Someone has said before, but it is always good to say that from the perspective of the pharmaceutical industry, no other sector has the infrastructure or the necessary resources in order to respond to big challenges such as this pandemic and to respond to many other medical conditions. According to a declaration by Francis Curry from the International Organization of Intellectual Property, its role is to bring incentives where innovation is protected in order to allow for the navigation and to be able to go from an invention to the commercialization of a product. And this is not something minor. It is a very complex process that requires many steps, scientific steps, regulatory steps, and the balance that we can attain. If we use intellectual property, all this will take us to optimum results, with the possibility of good options that will bring benefits to all the players in the health system. Intellectual property will protect and incentivize innovation, and it will allow us to continue with the research development for the development of new solutions for medical conditions. We've been able to respond quickly And research uses products, compounds, knowledge, and the research capacity that has been developed after all these years. And as an industry, for us, it is very important to be committed with governments working hand by hand with the different systems of the health system, so that we can make sure the best treatment is going to be available and is going to be accessible to all the patients who need it. It includes the consideration of and given access to innovation on a timely basis. Each time there is a solution to a medical condition, there is no justification for not to make it available to most, to all people who need it globally. And this is something that will have a very important impact on the Mexican health system. And as Fernando just said, it has very interesting developments. Last but not least, I would like to share with you some of the data and that we obtained in the BCI study, the one I mentioned, one by Kruger. The last one we have is the one from the year 2019, but the information within this result complements what Tim shared in his presentation of this study. That is the reason for us to be here today. This analysis, which is an analysis of competitiveness and the analysis of biopharmaceutical investment, it analyzes the ecosystem. It analyzes the ecosystem of the different countries in order to conclude which are the strengths and the weaknesses that can happen in the studies and the countries studied in the markets being studied. This was a global effort in 2019 in 32 countries. We hope it is going to be soon when we have a new result. But here there is a comparison to the Latin American countries and to global countries. And whether it has to do with Mexico, the result of the scoring effort when doing this survey, it has a positive aspect compared to the average in Latin America, which is slightly higher. 63% of all the factors studied, and this is something that I will be sharing with you in more detail. And here we also have the global level, which is the champion of the ecosystem for the biopharmaceutical investment, which is Singapore, that is 87%. And then the development of conditions presented in the studies analyzed from 2015 to 2019 in Mexico. What you see to the right side of the presentation, there is some decline, but in general terms, conditions are the same. There are some threats which are being identified, something to achieve a better results. So what is why we make this analysis? What is the area being analyzed? This survey, which is the biopharmaceutical ecosystem, considers the scientific capacity and the infrastructure, clinical studies, the regulatory systems, the financial considerations and access to market, and last but not least, the reason why we are today here, effective enforcement of intellectual property. In each one of these ones, in each one of these topics, Mexico has a performance slightly higher compared to Latin American countries, slightly higher in average, but with areas for improvement and opportunities that we should consider. Between the year 2017 and 2019, speaking about intellectual property, there was an increase in the best conditions, something important to speak about, and it relates to the provisions and the considerations of the free trade agreement, the USMCA that Fernando mentioned before. Here we have identified areas of opportunities. In infrastructure, we can see that the research and development capacities are hindered by the gaps in the infrastructure and by not enough budget allocated, and this is an area of opportunity in order to work. In the case we have in the state of Jalisco that is at the vanguard in many of these topics, and nationally, the regulatory system brings important challenges because here we find some barriers for the optimum development of the solutions for health. Initiatives are needed in order to improve pharmacosurveillance and the regulatory framework in order to have the potential to make the consolidation of the health systems effective, and at the same time those who have the opportunity to invest in biopharmaceutical activities can see Mexico as an interesting place to invest. Speaking about the clinical trials in Mexico, these clinical trials have been have been developed, but at the level of capacity of the places, sometimes there are some deficiencies. Speaking about access to market and to financing conditions, there are some areas to improve the transparency of the refund mechanism and the consolidated procurement. All this could represent a threat to have access to innovative products because of the conditions it brings and because of the deliberations generated by this topic in relationship to intellectual property topics. Last but not least, and specifically speaking about intellectual property, we always recommend to make best efforts to guarantee an effective enforcement of patents, considering and remembering that as of the year 2018, the USMCA has brought some positive aspects. And as Fernando said during his presentation, we need to keep working specifically in order to do the development of the USMCA conditions and what is going to be presented in 2025. So this is a brief analysis that I wanted to share with you from the regional and global perspective. And again, thanks a lot for this invitation to participate in this event. Thanks a lot, Dr. Juan Carlos Trujillo. Now, and thanks, Dr. Fernando Portugal, for being here with us and for making and presenting this valuable analysis about intellectual property in Mexico. Now we're going to give the floor to Professor Ramon, Coordinator of Technological and Knowledge Transfer at the University of Guadalajara, and he's going to be asking the questions by the audience to our presenters. Welcome, Ramon. Thanks all, and thanks to all the presenters. And the first question we have by the audience is for Tim or for Andrew. Which are the specific points that Mexico could improve in order to have research and development in the field of health sciences? What is to be improved? Tim or Andrew?
Maybe I'll go first, and then Andrew can follow up. I think, and some of the points that Juan Carlos just suggested, so that there are issues around the IP framework. So some of them are dealt with, or at least started with, in the industrial property law or the USMCA. So the enforcement, getting damages claims, getting that done on an efficient basis so people can protect their IP. There are some issues around regulatory data protection that need greater clarity. So I think that those are important on the intellectual property side, and intellectual property is important for innovation. The other part of this, and it's great that we're doing this in Jalisco, because I think you kind of set out how this can work, is the relationship between public and private investment in R&D, and making sure these are not seen as separate things. We invest in public basic research, and we have great universities, and we try to do innovation policy, and that creates employment. These need to be seen as an integrated set of issues, and this is where public-private partnerships, technology transfer officers, and just the culture of universities and large corporations working together, because all the evidence is universities and smaller companies, some of that is working quite well. And there's a lot of great science being done at universities. The bit that's not working well is the large corporate and the university sector, generally speaking, although there's some good examples at the state level. So I think that's the part of it which we need to work on, and that would mean that we could then facilitate the opportunity to use the strong skills base, the strong potential for clinical trials. There is some issues around the regulation of clinical trials, but there's a huge potential for the clinical trials to increase relatively quickly, and to interface that with the healthcare system. So that those two would be my starting point. And I think quickly they would actually lead to some quite material benefits. We're always talking about 5 years to see benefits here. Let's be realistic, innovation changes relatively slowly. But within 5 years, we think you could see some observable effects. But Andrew, would you agree with that or disagree?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tim. No, I would certainly agree with that. And I think there is, what I hope the study shows, a very powerful correlation between the IP system and the driving of the different areas that we all want to see, whether it's basic research, clinical trials, and so on. One particular area that we identified in the study is that some technology transfer officers in Mexico are hindered by university regulations that stop that interface between those technology transfer offices and the private sector. So again, I think these kind of things are unnecessary hurdles that could be readily overcome. And I think that's when we're looking at trying to encourage direct investment within markets, it's the building of trust and the personal connectivity between individuals that help drive that. You know, we always think that the national voice is always much more powerful at getting the politicians to move in the right direction. But so when you're hindering that positive discussion and collaboration between universities, technology transfer, and the private sector, that can never be a good thing. So for us, overcoming that, I think would be a huge benefit in Mexico.
Muchas gracias, Tim. Andrew, sin lugar a dudas, tenemos que avanzar en
Thanks, Tim and Andrew. Obviously, we need to improve this in our institutions and with the federal and with the state frameworks. Now, this is a question for any of you. Which are the research areas in health that you in pharmaceutical industry see as an opportunity to have alliances with the universities and with research? Speaking about cancer and chronic and degenerative diseases, which are the areas of opportunity with universities, for example?
Juan Carlos de FIPARMA, existen muchísimas áreas.
There are many areas where there is a big interest, as has been said. Mexico has a very positive characteristic, speaking about the research capacity and the academic quality. In the pharmaceutical industry at this very moment, the study of vaccines and the study of all the tests and the COVID treatment is in the very first place. But we have also seen an increase in the need to go deeper into chronic diseases, for example, oncology, for example, this being one of them, one of these medical conditions, and we want to be able to make progress. We want to overcome other challenges, chronic medical conditions, something that is also something we see with COVID. This is an area where Mexico has had a very important participation, and of course, there is a lot of interest. It's also the development of vaccines. So we say this in Mexico. If we see some of the AMIF and BPharma companies, there is a big interest to develop collaborations with the Mexican academic entities in order to do to have robust clinical trials where the physicians have a lot of experience. Fernando, do you have something additional to say? Yes, of course.
I believe that after speaking about after Juan Carlos Trujillo is always a big challenge because he has a very deep knowledge of what happens at the Latin American level, not only in Mexico. And it's been a pleasure to be with him in this forum. I apologize for this parenthesis, but I am also very happy to be here with people from the past and from today's time, from my daily practice, talking together with them here. Look, and to answer the question, I believe the areas of collaboration will be determined by the characteristics of the health status of the country. The health status, we have an important prevalence rate of diabetes in Mexico. I would say that this is one of the important characteristics of our population. So I believe there is not only interest by MIF and MIF Pharma companies, there is an interest in general by the society. So speaking about research, this will be the one. And we always find a new publications, scientific publications about developments being made in this field at different research centers and in Mexican universities. Today, another big challenge where we should have this very active cooperation is in a medical condition that doesn't only affect our country, which is the aging process of the world population, which is the Alzheimer's condition and dementia. This is coming because of the aging process. So this is another area where we have an important possibility to cooperate and to collaborate. And it is because of the circumstances that we are currently facing. So what we are missing is to improve communications amongst our research centers, universities, not only with companies in Mexico. I believe an effort should be made in order to talk to companies outside of the national territory. Thanks, Fernando. And now I will ask another question. Is there an international financing or industry-related company to finance joint research with the universities and with the private industry? Is there an international fund?
Well, I don't know if Andrew wants to go first. Do you want to go first? Or?
You can go first, Tim, and I can come in.
Okay. Well, I think there clearly are international funds to support basic research and support innovation. IMI is an important one in Europe, and clearly that often does involve global partners, but obviously has often a European lead. The pharmaceutical industry is the biggest investor in the development part, but also an important part of the R part of this industry. And I would have thought the financing links between corporate investments and universities is probably the easiest option, rather than going for kind of funding pools that exist. Because I think they're interesting, but I think when you see how R&D works in practice, this is often it's the combination of the universities and the private sector that leads to development kind of moving from an invention to an idea to something tested to something in patients. You know, the private sector is going to get involved at some point along that value chain. Much better if we can do that in a unified basis early on. I think it's the experience of many of the hubs, and what the hubs are trying to do from Boston to Cambridge is trying to make that relationship between private investment and public investment happen earlier, or communication to happen earlier, and it to be more fluid. So that's my instinct, rather than look for kind of institutional funding and looking for kind of is to try to get the private and the public sector talking to each other earlier, and to talk about joint projects earlier. Will be my starting point.
Yeah, and just to elaborate upon what Tim said, and it links to the previous question, innovation generally follows need. So if there's a need within a country, a particular disease area, then it makes sense for innovation to happen in a targeted way in relation to that need. I think the the lesson here is to get specific, so to be specialized. I think one thing that we found is successful in academia, if a university particulars to try to develop recognized expertise in a focused number of disease areas. Don't try to do everything, but become nationally recognized as a center of excellence within those disease areas. And over time, you may even become regionally and globally recognized. And it's that specialization will attract foreign partners, because then you are the place to go to, and that expertise that you develop will be incredibly valuable for collaboration. And I think, if we think about how funding works, as Tim mentioned, what Mexico needs to do is for the government and the state and federal government to create that mutually beneficial environment so those collaborations can take place, so that the hurdles around not being able to engage with the private sector for some universities and so on are removed, so that when you're generating your center of excellence and your expertise, then private sector is able to open the door and you're able to collaborate. And it's when you work out those areas of expertise is then you can work out which partners you may wish to target, because not all companies will work in all areas. There are certain funds that are focused on certain disease areas that you can capitalize on. So there's no global fund, if you like, for R&D, but there are certain funds that if you work in certain disease areas that you can capture, because there's a recognized need within those areas. One converse thing that's happened recently is the launch of the AMR, the Antimicrobial Resistance Action Fund by industry, where industry galvanized public funding to develop the next generation of antibiotics. So it was an industry idea that partnered with the European Investment Bank, the Wellcome Trust, and WHO in the driving of private sector capital, which moved in public sector finance into hopefully develop 2 or 3 novel antibiotics. So it can work the other way around too. And we're hoping that will bear fruit as that initiative seeks to if you like, catalyze in market conditions for countries to make development both at university and at private sector level attractive in the area of antibiotics.
Aquí, si me permiten agregar un poquito.
I would like to add something to this. And I will specifically speak about the case of Mexico, and speaking about this type of funds. There might be governmental, very specific funds in order to take care of some projects, but we do not have something that is national impact or federal impact funds. There is no timeline. There is no specific program for pharmaceutical innovation that would allow us to bring public and private financing to promote what the academia and with the researchers do. And let's even speak about past. It is not a problem of this administration. It has been something systemic and historical. But if we speak about the context of austerity we've seen in recent years, the availability of funds is decreasing at the federal level. But I do believe the answer to this question would be a later step. First, what we need to do is to diffuse, to communicate. And this is something that universities should do, to speak, to communicate the need for this, for this type of initiatives and the existence of these initiatives. And we need to have an effective communications of the work being done by the universities, speaking about medical and pharmaceutical research. This is the work to be communicated, and this is where the Interpat study is very important. And at the end of the day, I should confess this, USMCA and complying with the federal law of enforcement of industrial and intellectual property. This is something we see in other settings. This is something that we always see in the Mexican setting, in the Mexican context, not only in terms of innovation and pharmaceutical research. It is good, it applies to everything, but what is actually important, which is novel
approach is this about the strength of Mexico, speaking about research infrastructure. And since we have all this big auditorium from the academic sector and the research sector, this is precisely where the challenge is, to communicate, to tell companies and to tell the public sector the need to create this cooperation and joint collaboration in programs. And we need to talk to our federal authorities. We need to have bridges with them, and this is where the local work by the Secretariat of Innovation is very important. And I hope this example we see in Jalisco is going to be present in other places. And I also would like to complement from the regional perspective and global perspective, as Tim said, the pharmaceutical industry has very important investments in research and development, and this is part of our DNA, and we should also consider the very big interest in clinical trials, and Mexico has a great opportunity. The academic sector in Mexico is highly valued. Now, as Tim presented in the Interpat study and my ideas about the DCI, it is very important to remember that the executives of these international companies prioritize those countries where it is to be developed in the best possible way. And this is precisely where we need to follow the recommendations of the Interpat study, which are very precise recommendations because there is interest, there is will, and resources exist, but we're speaking about finite resources. And in my example, for example, Singapore, it is right at the years ahead of us of what we can do in Latin America. Years ahead of us. So the conclusion is not to compete with Singapore, but yes, we need to understand what we can clearly see in the Interpat study of why we could have an interesting setting for biopharmaceutical research. And one of the core components in the biopharmaceutical investment is clinical trials. Thanks, Juan Carlos. Very good comment. And now I will ask my next question. In the presentation, you said that clinical and clinical studies can be profitable, and we need to improve the infrastructure. You spoke about our good human resources. Have you identified those clinical studies where we could collaborate, or are we stopped by the regulatory improvements and COFEPRIS, or can we start working as of now in some already identified protocols for clinical trials and for preclinical trials? Look, speaking on behalf of AMIF, I'm sure there are many concrete examples for collaboration, but it would be, this is a question we would need to ask our experts in regulatory aspects. And this is a question for the experts in clinical trials. So if you leave us the email address of the person who is asking this question, we're going to be able to electronically and specifically answer this to this person, give an answer to this person. Yes, of course, and we're going to be very pleased to give you her email account. And now, where can we download the study? Tim, would you like to comment?
I was just going to comment on that last point, and I don't know the particular opportunities, but I suppose one of the things that we identified is kind of the speed of regulatory approval of clinical trials and getting that bit to work more quickly. And that's just, and this isn't only Mexico in this case, it's also just seeing that clinical trials are an opportunity. They're an opportunity for innovation. They're an opportunity for science. They're also an opportunity to get patients involved in healthcare in some particularly tricky diseases. So it's more not saying that we don't need to do all of the proper assessment and the risk assessment for clinical trials. Clearly we do. The regulatory threshold needs to be met, but seeing regular clinical trials as an opportunity rather than just a threat is really important. And I think that's, again, it's almost a change in mindset. And when you do that, you start to, as Andrew suggested, if you can start to build up areas of specialization in particular universities, that becomes the hub of expertise for those types of clinical trials. So that it will find the opportunities will find themselves if you build up. You've already got it in terms of the great universities, in terms of their specialization and a fast regulatory process. The clinical trials will find the experts, and that is one of the great things. Although clinical trials go on for a relatively long period of time, the great thing is clinical trials are constantly being started. So this is something where you can see reasonably quickly changes in and inflection points in the data. So clinical trials is, and Juan Carlos is exactly right, that is a good opportunity, and one where you can see the fruits of your policy change relatively quickly, which is always reassuring for policymakers, because otherwise they say, well, what have I achieved? Clinical trials you can, and you can see countries that have changed their environment relatively quickly. Sorry to interrupt, Ramon.
Esto es importantísimo lo que dice Tim. Yo no podría
But
estar
Tim
más
is very important. I couldn't agree more with you, Tim. And if we compare, which is something to my heart, with the Euro Cup and the soccer Euro Cup, we need to see the situation as a whole team. Or as long as we have a good goalkeeper, we need to be good also with the defense. We need to reach a balance. And what is very valuable about this Interpat study is that it will be the coach, the technical director, that will tell us how to place how to have a good balance formation, alignment, so that we can have the best results. Mexico has great quality, academic quality. Mexico has amazing education centers. There is an area of opportunity in terms of regulation and in intellectual property enforcement. But as Andrew said in his initial presentation, it is a whole, it is a continuum, a whole. So if we see the successful cases, and when you analyze the Singapore case, if we see each one of the elements, we see that those elements are being assessed, and we can see the very important development. So I do believe that one of the core messages of the study that was shared by Interpat is precisely that we need to have one complete team meeting the characteristics. We should not be outstanding in one position and pretty poor in other positions. In Latin America, we have the regulatory challenge, the intellectual property challenge, and the financing challenge. This is common to every country. We always say this with our Latin American colleagues. We are not alone, but we do have the tools in order to overcome, and Jalisco can help to the development because of the amazing results. But what we should do, as I already told you, is to have one team, the defense, the goalkeeper. We need to have all the best and outstanding positions and performers. Thanks a lot. So let's improve our whole team. Now, last but not least, this is a question on intellectual property. This is even more important during these days. Do you think the clearance of patents for the development of COVID-19 vaccines is going to be a key point to accelerate the fight against this pandemic? Look, what we have considered in AMIF and BIPARA, the key element to accelerate the production of vaccines is the commercial facilitation, to have the necessary conduits in order to expedite the production of this type of inputs for health. And it has to do with the clearance of tariffs and the regulatory improvement. In other words, the measures that could be hindering trade or release or to clear imports permits, for example, or aspects, regulatory aspects. This is what is very important to modify. This is what we need to expedite or accelerate, so that all the inputs needed to manufacture vaccines, so that all these inputs can be produced and manufactured in this context. And there are many specific proposals in order to facilitate the world population access, having and given access to the world population to these vaccines. The patent by itself, or to clear or to accept a patent, it doesn't imply its production. Rather, the key factor is to strengthen the productive capacities and the distribution capacities and the logistics aspect. There are many fundamental, very important aspects. For example, one vaccine, when it comes to the point of entry into a country, develop or a developing country, it will not walk alone all the way to the patient. There is logistics needed so that we can bring the product to the final, to the end user, to the patient in optimum conditions. And the development of this logistics and the development of this capacity, it implies technological capacity, commercial capacity, and this is precisely where we need to focus our cooperation. Intellectual property is a human right as well, and of course it has to be harmonized with the human right to health, but it's been a key incentive, and instead of stopping and instead of hindering innovation and instead of hindering the creation of inputs for health as needed to fight COVID, instead of hindering, the opposite has happened. It has been promoted, it has been fostered. Even our president, in a very recent conference 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago, he said that if he had to nominate someone for the Nobel Prize, in the case of sciences, it would be the scientists and companies. This is precisely what he said. Those who develop vaccines, intellectual property and patents, this is an incentive and it promotes, this is the driving force of what is needed so that the pandemic stops being a pandemic. And we don't want this to be this big a risk for human health. And it should be the opposite. We need to collaborate. We need to create scientific as well as productive capacities so that the world population, or most of the global population, can reach immunity brought by the immunization as soon as possible, because of course we should remember that we are not safe until we are all safe. Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, the time for the questions and answers is over. Thanks to all the public for your questions. Presenters, thanks for answering 2 questions, and I'm sure you are going to you will receive the link. This was one of the questions, where if it is possible to download the study. I already asked the organizers to please give you the link in order to download this report. And now, Larissa, you have the floor over. Thanks, Professor Ramon. And as you said, we're going to give the floor over to Professor Larissa from the Ministry of Innovation, Science, Technology in Jalisco, and she's going to officially close this event. Thanks, Kenya, for this introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank Margarita, Andrew, team, Fernando, Juan Carlos, thanks. Thanks, Professor Ramon Wilman, for your questions, because always attendees will ask questions, and this is precisely what this is all about. We want people to ask questions, and we want to be able to respond those questions. Thanks all. It was a very important and interesting dialogue. Many topics were presented, very important topics, not only from the governmental perspective. I believe there are several points, but what matters the most is the continuity of the public policies, how important it is to have a long-term policy and vision. This is very important for not to destroy what is working well, and to be able to build and take very good steps the future for Mexico, specifically speaking about the development with the pharmaceutical industry. The second important point is our capacity and talent, and I'm sure some of the most important studies is the capacities and the skills of a country. Speaking about research, all this is going to be the reason to become stronger as a country. So we need to focus a lot on this, speaking about public policies. But what is positive, and this is something we see in the study, one of them, the benefit of the Mexican capacities and capabilities, and then how can we relate all this and link all this with other players, because it is not only universities and government, but we should also talk to the users and to the pharmaceutical industry, and to talk to other international organizations. So this is the starting point, and it is a match where we need to all play And as someone said, speaking about soccer, and something that is important, and because of my relationship with universities and the audience, they all want to know what is the interest of the pharmaceutical industry to work jointly. So it is the researchers, the ones more interested in talking to the industry. So I believe what we need to do is to work with the mechanisms. And since here we have, and since I made the commitment, we should all be committed to talk closer with PIPARA and with AMIF and with international organizations of the industry so that we can talk about the mechanism, the easiest mechanism, and to be the bridge. And I believe this is an effort we need to start soon. Another thing that I really like, and this is the question we see every day, which are the lines of research, which are the actual interest for the industry in the mid and long term. And I believe Juan Carlos, he was very precise. Chronic and degenerative diseases, I know about many research lines already working in this diseases. So we need to talk to you. We need to see what you can do, and we can start joint efforts. And what is very important to me now is the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework for drugs. And this is the biggest challenge in Mexico. It is a federal situation, but I believe from the local perspective, we can start promoting so that we can improve the public policy aspect. And there are many more points, but I believe these are the most relevant points. And these are the questions by the researchers, and we need to work with the authorities that manage, that are in charge of this leadership, to do research and development efforts. So these are the most relevant conclusions. And thanks all for attending, the University of Guadalajara for helping us and to host this study, the communication of this study, Interpat, AMIF, and in this Infarma for the support. And thanks to all my colleagues from the entity we work for. And thanks for your questions. Without further ado, thanks all for being here. We're going to see you soon and have a great day. Thanks a lot and have a great day. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Professor, for your kind words. And we also thank the Mexican Association of Pharmaceutical Research Industries and the Latin American industry for helping, for inviting us to be part of this very important event. And thanks to all the presenters, Dr. Margarita Hernandez for participating, for actively collaborating in this organization, Dr. Andrew, Dr. Tim, Dr. Fernando Portugal, Dr. Juan Carlos, and Professor Ramon. Thanks all, and we hope all the ones here in this event, we hope it's been good for you, and thank you all for being here. Thanks.
Many thanks indeed. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Hombre, pues muchas gracias. Ya terminó la transmisión, ¿verdad?
Me estoy preguntando, Enrique. Sí. Me comentaba Enrique que iba a decir